Meeting on the crossroads where the two forbidden subjects of politics and religion intersect. This is the Sophie Scholl Monologue. I'm Mel McGinnis, and with me once again is James Hagberg. And I'm sure if you stay with us, you will be stimulated in your thoughts, because what James, I feel, has to say is thought-provoking. And I talked with him before, and he says it's a subject we don't think enough about and even talk enough about. So let's get right into it. James, what's on your mind that you'd like to have discussed today?
Well, I suppose I should say first, it's not that it's not talked about enough. Quite possibly, I believe that people talk about it in the wrong senses, which is political theory, and how we as people, as a society, decide to organize ourselves, and through our economy, how we decide to manage our resources.
Okay.
Because the problem that often arrives, especially in the United States with our two-party system, we talk about politics an awful lot. And we talk about various ideologies an awful lot. But I think that it's become so one-sided. We've become so polarized that certain terms are simply thrown around without much thought being put into what the actual meaning or the definition of said terms were originally.
For example?
I think a couple of great examples is things like fascist.
Okay.
We hear fascist a lot.
Right.
We hear terms like communism and socialism a lot. And I would say, not always, of course, but I say a lot of the time they don't exactly apply. And they aren't exactly fair terms to be used in those situations. And I think that's simply because it's complicated. It's easy to lump a bunch of people together and call them something bad. A great example is the left loves to call Republicans and conservatives fascists. You're a fascist because, well, the fascists did lots of bad things and I don't like you. And you have something, and I can point to like a couple of things you have in common with a fascist. Ergo, you're a fascist.
Right.
Without actually understanding the definition of what makes someone a fascist.
I think you're right on the target there. Using terms that people are familiar with, but not in the sense of what the word means. And really, we need to understand the meaning of the word in order to know if that label is being applied correctly.
Right. So one of the first things I like to talk about when discussing these terms is, where did they come from? And how did we get to where we are? Because it's easy to simply, there's a lot of these ideologies like communism and fascism, and there are groups of people that would say that they're interchangeable, that they're all effectively the same ideology. When they look at it, that there are certain aspects and tactics that they both employ but they don't look at the actual goals and reasonings behind them. I think something really interesting is the discussion of the political left and the political right, and what constitutes the left and the right. And a lot of people aren't even aware where these terms originated. What makes something politically right-wing and what makes it politically left-wing? When the truth is, these terms actually originated in the French Revolution. During the early stages of the French Revolution in the French Parliament, fairly early on, two factions formed with the radical Jacobins and the more conservatives, who were more interested in only reforming the monarchy, and the Jacobins, the revolutionaries, who were interested in total abolition of the monarchy. And it came to a point when, in the French Parliament, they established an unspoken rule that all of the conservatives would go and move to the right side of the president of the Congress, and all of the radicals, the Jacobins, would go to the left side, simply to make it more convenient to count votes, and so that you would be it made it easier to tally votes within the Congress. And from that is where we got one of the most pinnacle aspects of the right and left being with the right being characterized as culturally conservative and the left being culturally progressive.
Wow. So you can trace it right back to the French Revolution to understand how we, in a sense, use the terms right wing, left wing.
Yes. Before that, there wasn't a left wing and a right wing. Almost everything was, you were either a monarchy or there were well, really, there was only the United States as a functioning democracy at the time. Democracy was an fairly untested and considered to be an impractical system of government. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of human history, humans have been ruled by a small oligarchy of tyrants. And another thing when it comes to the development of political theory, I think the most important thing has just been the improvements in a standard of living and, more importantly, education. Because democracy requires an educated population for it to effectively function. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't have an informed voter base, it's easy for corrupt politicians and other oligarchs to promise whatever they want without having any actual plan of delivering on them, and the voting base will simply vote for it because it sounds nice.
Now, I would say people feel like that's what's happening today.
It certainly has. And that's definitely a topic that needs to be discussed a lot more with how do you maintain a democracy is important.
Mm-hmm. But we want to focus more on the theory right here in our discussion as you've been bringing out this whole development of right wing, left wing, going back to the French Revolution. And if I understand right, I may be off on this, this is how fascism basically came about, in that the fascists, I could be wrong on this, were lumped in together with those on the right wing.
Well, fascism as an ideology originated in the early 20th century in Italy. It was the first so-called fascists were the Italian Fascio Party. But an interesting other term is there were a lot of ideologies, a lot of different groups and parties that we would call fascists that didn't call themselves fascists, obviously. The National Socialists, the Nazi Party of Germany, the Phalangists of Spain, the militarists in Japan. We call them all fascists, but they all had radically different governments and different systems implemented. But there were certain aspects of them that political science uses to determine where they would align themselves on a political spectrum. Now, it's easy to simply say the most basic thing that they all have in common is authoritarianism and collectivism. And this is where a lot of people will confuse and lump fascism with authoritarian communism, Stalinism, and the Soviet Union and China. But the problem is they're both authoritarian ideologies. Mm-hmm. They both revolve around a collectivist culture that prioritizes the good of the group over the good of the individual.
Right.
But the reason we don't categorize them as the same thing, why I believe that's inaccurate, is because the most important factor of, again, when you're determining the right and the left wing, it was originally cultural, because you can be culturally left wing, which, as stated before, is usually is characterized as culturally progressive. Mm-hmm. I like to determine it as culturally revolutionary. Is another way of determining it, as the main objective of the left wing culture is change, is to modify, to upheave the current social climate. Now, whether that's the abolition of slavery, whether that's the expanding of voting rights to the disenfranchised, or if that's the destruction of the nuclear family and traditional values. It's a sliding bar, because one would say the same goes for conservatism. Conservatism is simply the cultural stance of attempting to preserve one's past. Mm-hmm. And whether that past is a tradition of family values, or if that's a past of oppression and segregation, it's different for different cultures and different groups of people. So Where fascism comes into play, and many people will accuse what people we consider the founder of fascism, Benito Mussolini, as being, well, they're simply socialists because he himself was a member of the Italian Socialist Party before being kicked out because of his changing views. The Fascist Party was originally designed to be an authoritarian collectivist call of the Italian people, the Italian race. Fascism is best described as the state being the body. Mm-hmm. The state is a body, and all of the individual people are simply small, like blood cells within that body. And their purpose is to work and to better the state. However, usually this is also for the overall goal of benefiting the people, the race. Oftentimes, fascism is a racially motivated ideology, as it was with the Italians, the Spanish, the Japanese. It's not necessarily that way. I think there are actual fascist ideologies. British fascism under Oswald Mosley actually advocated for a union of races.
Okay.
Separate but equal, as they often would.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But usually, and the reason fascism would be considered right-wing is because it's always been characterized, the reason we would all consider them is the sense of a call to protect their culture, to protect aspects of their culture, because in Japan, in Germany, in Italy, fascism was almost unanimously a counter-revolution to the liberal ideas of democracy and progressivism and emancipation for segregated peoples. Fascism was a call to uphold traditions and standards that had existed in these places, a call to return to, in Italy, they borrowed heavily off of the old mythos of the Roman Empire. Italy, Mussolini's dream was to reestablish a great Mediterranean empire like that of the old Roman state. And his goal to unify these lands was the reconquest of a Roman state.
It sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, this collectivist commonality with the other forms of authoritarianism. I mean, that is, communism, we would say, is collectivist.
Yes.
Fascism is collectivist. But they're not the same. They go about it through different strategies, different policies, different approaches.
I would say fascism and communism, they have different goals. Mm-hmm. They're different ideologies. They have different goals. They have different ideas of how society and people should work. The reason that they're often considered similar is because they often have similar ways of going about it. They both fascism and communism have the object of using the state and collective and a collective group identity. Whether in communism it's class identity, or fascism where it's often national or racial identity.
Yeah,
they have different goals, and oftentimes they seemingly contradict. I mean, something that during the Cold War, the United States propped up dozens of fascist regimes in the sake of stopping communism. So effectively, we often would look aside fascist dictatorships simply because they weren't communists.
And yet they were still authoritarian.
They were still authoritarian and brutal regimes.
Yeah.
And it's a subject that I think it's both complex, but I see why that a lot of people find it easier to just simply say, because authoritarianism is bad,
right?
Obviously,
right?
No, I don't think any fairly reasonable individual is going to advocate for a authoritarian, all-powerful state. Mm-hmm. Not a fairly liberal or progressive individual should, but I do believe it's somewhat disingenuous, and I think one of the problems that arises from simply grouping all of these ideologies, because they all have because even within what we would term fascists, there are myriads of small cultural differences. And from the standard of how they organize their economy and how they distribute resources, exactly what kind of society they want is dependent on the people, the group, and what they believe is best for their national identity. But at the end of the day, I believe the reason we call them fascist is because the right is considered the side of cultural conservatism. The other aspect of the political spectrum that did arise later is the economic spectrum. Because culture is the way groups of people collectively agree to a sense on their beliefs, their standards, the rules and laws of a society, and the traditions of that society. Culture is different across all groups of people across the entire planet. The economy, however, is how groups of people decide to manage the resources they have. And so while on the cultural scale, you have on opposing sides revolutionary progressivism or cultural conservatism, you also find on the economic scales, you find capitalism on an economically right-wing scale and socialism on an economically left-wing scale. An interesting topic about switching over to the left wing for a moment of communism and socialism is they aren't technically interchangeable terms. Because communism is the cultural ideology of collectivization. And socialism is the economic model of a more collectivized society. Now, you can't be a communist if you aren't a socialist, but you can be a socialist without being a communist. You can still they are still in that same camp of socialists, and they're still. I'm not here to defend socialism, but I do believe that there are differences that can be raised and valid points that should be discerned between, say, the communist regimes of the past and certain modern socialist ideals. I'm not advocating for those ideals, but I believe there are differences that should be acknowledged before simply lumping Bernie Sanders in with Stalin.
Yeah, right.
I'm not supporting Bernie Sanders. I'm saying that I think it's somewhat disingenuous when we a lot of individuals would, again, it's easier that way.
Yes.
It's and that's the problem is to understand the differences. It takes a lot of time.
Right.
But I think, and that's one of the things that I think we need to work more as a free culture. And what's important is to understand these ideas, because it's easy to simply lump all of the people. Because once you lump a certain set of ideas as the villains, anyone that has anything similar to that idea, you can very easily push in with them and completely disregard whatever they're saying.
Yeah.
And that's what both sides of the political spectrum do in America.
Yeah, I really think that's a good point you're making. That is, we need to take the time to thoroughly understand the terms we've just been talking about. Not only understand them in the contemporary sense, but also in the historical sense, so that we don't resort to this labeling, which confuses the issue, but can be very effective in staking out your political claim. And once we're more informed, we can talk about these subjects in a much more mature way, which I think now are really lacking, especially as you watch conversations on television and whatnot. With wrapping this time up here, the aspect of theory and the development of thought. We've talked about left wing, right wing, communism, socialism, and I think it was great that you brought up the point. Let me see if I got it right. To be a communist, you also have to be a socialist, but you can be a socialist yet not a communist.
Yes.
Could you flesh that out just a little bit more?
So it mixes in with the ideas of culture and economy and how they play off each other. So the cultural goal of communism has always been the abolition of state and private property. And through that, they've always had to bond themselves with the economic ideals of socialism, which is the collectivization of production. And an interesting thing about is one of the most interesting discussions I heard on the subject of socialism and communism is that, and the best argument that I've personally ever heard for a socialist and communist system was that, and I believe Marx himself to a degree advocated that communism is not necessarily to be the antithesis of capitalism. However, it is to be the following stage of human development. Just as capitalism developed out of serfdom, capitalism is not slavery. It was never slavery. It developed out of it. It progressed from it. And we've improved on it. The idea of communism was, even Marx acknowledged that no human system has ever been able to produce as much as capitalism. And the idea was that with the development of more improved machinery and tools of production and a greater and more educated base population, that you could transition away from a privatized economy to a socialized economy where resources are, because we have enough, and this is in my opinion the final flaw of communism that it stands today is we have the means to produce more than enough food, more than everyone could have a house, they could have a car, they could have probably their own plane at this rate. We could produce enough to home, feed, clothe every person on earth. And the idea was that as time went on, capitalism would gradually give way to communism. Now, oftentimes, if this didn't work, the communists believed that social revolution was the other alternative to violently upheave it. However, the problem that always seems to arise is the human factor that a lot of people don't take into consideration, which is one of the problems that authoritarian regimes have often stumbled upon. And which is why it's always been easier for authoritarian regimes to simply divert to quelling the population through lessening education. Because most authoritarian regimes throughout history, they've focused on a basic education. They want everyone to be able to read and function within their society, but aspects such as critical thinking and the ability to sustain oneself outside of the group they work in contrast to the goals of an authoritarian regime.
Right, because the collective is superior or given priority over the individual.
Yes.
So it's the interests of the collective that has to be preserved and prioritized rather than the individual person advancing himself or herself.
Yes. And to finish the point on whether, how could you be a socialist but not a communist? Now, I understand that the term socialism is somewhat difficult to define because there are so many different advocates for the ideology. But examples are democratic socialism.
Yes,
we discuss this a lot. And democratic socialists today aren't advocating for the abolition of private property. They have no goals of the deconstruction of the state apparatus. So an example of is their goal is to restructure the economy to be one of a collectivized system rather than a privately owned competitive free market capitalist system, where corporations, rather than being independent with the goal of acquiring personal profit for that corporation, would be to reallocate resources based on individual and group needs. And that's just the sort of thing where the semantics come into play, and where it becomes harder because the ideology is different, and it necessarily shouldn't be treated the same as communism. I think But that doesn't mean that we need to necessarily be supporting these ideals. I just think it's important to understand them as what they are.
Exactly. So when we hear the term collectivist, we understand that's an umbrella term in a sense for fascism, communism, socialism, authoritarian would be like another umbrella. And when we talk about socialism, as you say, you can have a democratic socialist, but it's impossible to have a democratic communist.
I mean, effectively. Yeah. I mean, the communists would argue otherwise.
Yeah.
As an interesting, somewhat off topic, but on that note, many communists would argue that the only true form of democracy would be a communist system, as democracy literally translates to the power of the people, where in a idealistic communist system, all individuals are equally represented and have equal power in the functions of society.
Yeah. And I've also heard it said that communists are also capitalists. It's just that they own it rather than pure capitalism where the individual has ownership over what is done with resources and things like that. So I think this topic of political theory discussed at a level which you are challenging all of us as Americans to develop, I think is very important in the political discourse we observe going on in Washington, D.C., Albany, New York, or in your case, being a Pennsylvanian in Harrisburg. So we'll pick up on this the next time as we talk more about the aspects of the importance of having thorough discussions on political theory.